Hello everyone, welcome to our channel. Today I want to invite you to embark on a journey of faith, trust, and hope. We're going to talk about one of the greatest examples of trust in God that ever existed, Abraham. Have you ever felt uncertain about the future? Have you gone through times when it seemed like everything was out of control, and when looking ahead, you couldn't see where your decisions were leading you? Abraham went through that too. He received a divine calling that seemed unreal, but through his faith, God used his life to bless the entire world. In this video, we will look at Abraham's life and draw powerful lessons that will help you better understand your own journey of faith. Believe me, the steps of Abraham could be the same steps you need to take to see the impossible become a reality in your life. Are you ready to take the first step of faith? Then let's begin. Abraham, in his homeland of Ur of the Chaldeans, had everything any man could desire: status, wealth, comfort, and security. He was part of a highly organized society that was advanced for its time, and everything seemed to be in perfect order. His days were probably marked by a peaceful routine with the assurance of a secure future. But at an unexpected moment, God broke into Abraham's life saying, "Leave your country, your people, and go to the land I will show you." Genesis 12:1. There was no clear destination, no certainty about where he would be going or what he would find. God was calling Abraham to leave behind the familiar, to abandon what was comfortable and secure, and walk on a completely unknown path. Now imagine the impact of this. Have you ever felt comfortable in your life, and suddenly something or someone calls you to step out of that comfort zone? That's exactly what God did with Abraham. And the key here is not just in the going or the leaving, but in the act of fully trusting God, even without knowing where he was being led. Abraham's trust was not in the destination, but in the God who was guiding him. Abraham could have argued. He could have asked questions like, "Why me?" or "What will happen to me and my family?" But he chose to listen to God's call and follow without visible guarantees. This is pure faith. Abraham showed that faith is trusting in God when we don't know the details of the path, but we know that he is with us. How many times in our lives do we receive a call from God and hesitate because the future seems unclear, uncertain, and frightening? Abraham's call challenges us to change the way we see uncertainties. Instead of fearing the unknown, we can trust that God is already there, guiding us and leading us to a future that, even though unseen, we can believe in. After Abraham responded to God's call, something even more impressive happens. God makes a grand promise to Abraham: "I will make you a great nation." It's not just a promise about his prosperity, but about the future and eternity. Abraham, who had no children, is promised to be the father of a great nation, something that seemed completely out of reach of his reality, especially considering his age and the barrenness of his wife, Sarah. What does this promise really mean? Let's think more deeply here. When God tells Abraham that he will be the father of a great nation, he is not just talking about physical descendants. God is talking about an eternal legacy, an impact that transcends generations. The greatness of God's promise is not limited to the multiplication of children, but to the multiplication of blessings, reaching all the families of the earth. God does not just promise Abraham that he will have a great nation. He promises that this nation will be a blessing to all the other nations. And throughout the biblical story, we see how Abraham's descendants, through his son Isaac, from Isaac to Jacob, and later from Jesus Christ, would become a blessing to all of humanity. Now, if we look at our own lives, this promise teaches us something powerful about inheritances and spiritual legacies. Sometimes God does not just give us a blessing for our immediate life, but he calls us to be part of something greater, something that affects future generations. God does not make promises just for the present. He sees our lives within an eternal plan, where our decisions, our faith, and our obedience impact not only our generation, but all future generations. Abraham was challenged to believe in something he could not see, but trusted that God would fulfill the promise, even if it wasn't immediate. For Abraham, this promise was an act of radical faith, and his response was to follow without hesitation. And just like him, you too are called to trust in God's promises for your life, even when they seem distant, even impossible. After the great promise, Abraham faces a challenging situation. A severe famine hits the land of Canaan. He then decides to go to Egypt in search of food, but upon arriving there, insecurity and fear take hold of his heart. Upon seeing the beauty of his wife, Sarah, Abraham fears that the Pharaoh, wanting to take her for himself, will kill him. Instead of trusting God to protect his life and his wife's, he makes a hasty decision. He lies, saying that Sarah is his sister, not his wife. Here we see Abraham's human side. Fear, the man of faith, the man who heard God's voice and trusted in such a great calling, was still subject to moments of insecurity and lack of faith. He was not immune to fear and weakness. Like us, he sometimes found himself in situations where his faith was tested and he failed. What can we learn here? Even when we fail, God does not abandon us. Abraham failed by lying, by trying to protect himself in the wrong way. But God intervened, protecting Sarah and restoring Abraham. God made a miraculous intervention, sending plagues upon Pharaoh, who quickly realized something was wrong and returned Sarah to Abraham. This experience was a powerful lesson that our faith is not perfect, but God is perfect. God even uses our failures to teach us to trust more deeply in Him. Have you ever made a mistake out of fear or insecurity? Perhaps, like Abraham, you took a path that seemed safe in your mind but didn't fully trust in God. No matter how much we fail, God uses even our mistakes to teach us and shape us. Abraham and Lot face a situation where the space for grazing their flocks becomes limited, and their herdsmen start to argue. Abraham then proposes a generous solution. He gives Lot the choice of land, allowing Lot to choose whatever he wants, knowing that he, as the uncle and leader, could have taken the best land. Here we see Abraham's heart in action, generous, confident, and selfless. He didn't feel the need to secure the best part for himself. Abraham knew that his security didn't depend on land or material possessions, but on God's promise and care. This attitude of Abraham is a shining example of how we should live our lives. Sometimes life places us in situations where we have the chance to choose something that benefits us. But Abraham teaches us that the true blessing comes when we choose to be generous, when we prefer the good of others instead of our own advantage. This attitude is not just about material goods, but about choosing generosity and trust in God in both the small and big decisions of life. When you choose to be generous, you are showing that your trust is in God, not in circumstances. Abraham showed that by letting go of something, God blesses us in ways we cannot imagine. After the separation from Lot, God approaches Abraham with a powerful and meaningful message. This moment is crucial for Abraham and for understanding his relationship with God. In Genesis 15, God appears to Abraham and once again reinforces his promise. Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, and your reward will be very great. Genesis 15:1. This first declaration from God to Abraham is not just a reminder of the promise of a great descendants, but an affirmation of security and protection. God presents himself as a shield, someone who will protect Abraham from all dangers. God was, at that moment, solidifying Abraham's trust, showing him that beyond the promise of children and land, he could trust God for his safety and prosperity. Abraham was on a journey that required faith, trust, and surrender, and God was saying, I will be with you every step of the way. Abraham, in a moment of doubt, asked God, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? Genesis 15:8. He was questioning how he could be sure that God would fulfill his promises. Abraham, even though he was a man of faith, still had doubts, something many of us can relate to. Sometimes, even when we are convinced that God has made promises to us, the challenges of life and the uncertainty of the future can create fear and doubt. And this is completely human. In response to Abraham's doubt, God asked him to bring some animals, a heifer, a goat, and a ram, all 3 years old, and also asked for a dove and a pigeon. Abraham sacrifices them, and then God does something surprising. He enters into a covenant with Abraham, a deeply symbolic and meaningful act. God's covenant with Abraham is not just a verbal promise, but a pact sealed with blood. In the culture of that time, a covenant of this nature involved the division of animals, with the parties involved in the covenant passing between the parts of the sacrificed animals. The act of walking between the parts meant that if anyone broke the covenant, the same fate as the sacrificed animals would befall them. Therefore, the ritual had a meaning of total and irrevocable commitment. Here's the key point. God is doing something extraordinary. He is making a covenant with Abraham in such a solemn way that instead of Abraham walking between the parts of the animals, it is God who walks alone. God, in his sovereignty, takes full responsibility for the promise and the fulfillment of the covenant. He was telling Abraham, I take responsibility for fulfilling this promise, even if you or your descendants fail. I will remain faithful. The fact that God passed alone between the parts of the animals shows that God was committed to Abraham and his descendants, regardless of human faithfulness. God's faithfulness does not depend on our perfection. Abraham and his descendants would fail many times, but God remained firm in his commitment. This teaches us that the fulfillment of God's promises is not always immediate. Sometimes God's promises are fulfilled in a time that goes beyond our own life. Abraham never saw the fullness of this promise come to pass, but he was assured that his descendants would live to see the promised land. God teaches us to trust in his promises, even when they seem delayed, or their fulfillment is beyond our vision and timing. Next, God reveals to Abraham the future of his descendants. He tells him that, although Abraham has a great promise of descendants, his children would be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years, Genesis 15:13. God was foretelling the time of oppression in Egypt, but he also promised that he would free them and give them the promised land. This teaches us that the fulfillment of God's promises does not mean the absence of difficulties. The journey of faith is not without challenges, but God was assuring Abraham that, despite the hardships, his promise would be fulfilled. In the end, God reaffirms his promise to give Abraham the land of Canaan, a land full of riches, blessings, and opportunities for his descendants. At this moment, Abraham has a glimpse of a glorious future, but also of a future that would involve suffering and difficulties. The journey of faith is not without challenges, but God was assuring Abraham that, despite the difficulties, his promise would be fulfilled. What does this mean for us today? When we read the covenant between God and Abraham, we can apply this truth to our own lives. God has made deep and eternal promises to us, and like Abraham, we are invited to trust in them, even when we do not see immediate fulfillment. God's covenant with Abraham teaches us that God is faithful, and his faithfulness does not depend on our failures or limitations. Even when we face difficulties like Abraham, we can rest in the assurance that God will fulfill what he has promised. If you are going through a time of doubt or suffering, remember that just like Abraham, you can trust that God's promises will be fulfilled in your life, even if you do not see immediate results. God is faithful, and he never fails. Just as he made a covenant with Abraham, he also made a covenant with us through Jesus Christ, the greatest promise of all. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promise, and through him, all of God's blessings become ours. With this, we conclude that the covenant with Abraham is a powerful message of commitment, trust, and divine faithfulness. Even amidst uncertainty and human failures, God remains faithful. And like Abraham, we are called to trust in his promises, regardless of the circumstances. God made a covenant with us, and just as he did with Abraham, he has guaranteed the fulfillment of his promises. If you are going through times of difficulty or doubt, do not give up on God's promises. God is faithful to fulfill what he said, just as he did with Abraham. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he will fulfill his word in your life. Now reflect on this. In what area of your life do you need to trust more in God's promises? He is faithful, and his covenant with you is guaranteed. No matter what you face, he will fulfill everything he promised. If this message has touched you, subscribe to the channel and share it with those who need to hear this as well. Don't forget to leave your comment and engage in this walk of faith. We are in this journey together.